Good evening, it's Pastor Bob here at Sunrise Community Church. Glad to be with you today. Yep, and we've had some weather this afternoon. It's rained a little bit. It got a little colder. Maybe have a little snow tonight. And it's going to be beautiful though by Saturday afternoon. Sunday's supposed to be almost 60 degrees and sunshine. We're looking forward to that. Looking forward to a great day. And this Sunday we'll continue our story or our talk about Jonah. Last week we talked to you about Jonah. We talked to you about Assyria. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. We talked to you about just what a cruel and wicked place that was, and how mean they were, how evil they were, and in a direct parody to God's call. I mean, God calls Jonah to arise and go to Nineveh, and Jonah arises and goes in the complete opposite direction. I mean, God calls Jonah to go east and he goes west. In short, Jonah did the exact opposite of what God told him to do. And you know, he was directed to travel overland, and he went by the sea. He was sent to the big city, and instead he buys a one-way ticket to the end of the world. And you need to understand at this point, as I'm sure Jonah understood, he couldn't see any reason. He couldn't see any reason practically or theologically for God's call on him, for his call for him to go to Nineveh. I mean, Nineveh is this wicked place, and Israel is God's people. It seems like that Nineveh and Assyria have positioned themselves on a collision course with God's people. Why in the world would God send Jonah there? Jonah can't see it. Not only that, but a few years before, the prophet Nahum had already prophesied about the destruction of Nineveh. So if Jonah did go to Nineveh and he had a successful mission, wouldn't that make the prophet Nahum a false prophet? Wouldn't that destroy God's people? Wouldn't it destroy Israel? I mean, there's no practical sense for this whatsoever, or theological sense. And Jonah decides, if I can't see a reason for God telling me to do this, there must not be a reason. And that's pretty old. I mean, that's the same thing Adam and Eve decided in the Garden of Eden. You'll remember, I believe it's Genesis 2. God tells them, he says, you can eat of any tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then, of course, we jump over to Genesis 3, and they looked at the fruit. And they saw it was delicious. It looked good. It was pleasing to the eye. They thought, and God had given no reason, so they concluded that if God didn't give them a reason, then there must not be a reason. So they ate the fruit, just like Jonah went the other way when God told him to do that, because they believed that God couldn't be trusted to look out for their good. They believed that you would have to force God to do something good for you. They believe the lie that God does not care about us and look out for our good. And we've been dealing with that all through history. I mean, we have things that happen in our life and trials and that happen in our lives, things that happen with our health, things that happen with our relationships, things that happen with our jobs. And we think sometimes, wow, if there is a God up there, he certainly doesn't know what he's doing. That's the story of Jonah. We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about different ways to run from God. Paul talks in Romans chapter 1, he talks about the people, the wicked Gentiles, he calls them, that are evil, they're wicked, they're mean, they're liars, they're cheats, all these things, and he says they're not any good. And then in Romans chapter 2, he talks about the Bible-believing, the Bible-thumping Jews, if you would, and how they knew the law, and they were so perfect in it, and they wanted, and he says, then he comes up with this great summation in Romans chapter 3, and he says, no, not one of these people is good. Neither the Gentiles or the Jews. What Paul is saying, and we all know, that you can run away from God by completely going the other way, completely leaving him behind and just doing whatever you want to do. But Paul says you can also run away from God by doing everything that God says for you to do, trying to be super religious. And do that because you're doing it not for God, not in love for Him, but you're doing it for your own good in a way to try to make Him indebted to you. One guy has said the way to avoid Jesus is to avoid sin. In other words, if you're doing all these things that you're supposed to do in the church and everything, then God just can't ask anything of you. I mean, He owes you. Look what all you've done. And that's the story that's going on here in Jonah. And we've all faced those kind of faults and those kinds of things in our life. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about how that relates to our lives and how that relates to our thought process and everything that we do today in our life and how that we bring it forward. We're going to be talking about how we're going to go back and at the end we're going to touch just a little bit on the resurrection again. Because, God brought mercy into this world through weakness and apparent defeat. And, that's what He's wanting to show Jonah here. Exactly how He works. One of the things that I really find amazing is that when Jonah sins, which is disobeying God, that's sin. People always ask me, well, what's sin? Well, sin is a broken relationship. It's a rebellion against God. It's just that simple. And when Jonah sins here, boy, I tell you what, the outcome of that is dramatic and it's intense. The mighty storm is hurled against that ship. And, that's not usually the case, is it? That's not usually how it happens in our lives. I mean, we do something and really is no big consequence. We still feel normal. It might be months or years later before we really see the impact of that on our lives. We're going to talk about how that works out in our lives, how the storms of life come on us. Another thing that I notice is, Jonah wasn't the only one in that boat. The sailors were in that boat too. And you know what? I've noticed that a lot of times some of the storms that come in my life, they're not actually the cause of particular sin that I've committed, but they're just the natural outcome of me living in a fallen world. So, Jonah talks about this, but I want you to understand, and we will talk about it Sunday, I mean, the whole book of Job shows us that the idea that if you're a good person, that you're going to have a great and blessed life and nothing bad will ever happen to you. And if you're having bad things happen to you, it's your fault. And that's the reason. The whole book of Job tells us that's not true. It's a popular thought today that if I live good, that everything is going to go well, but we know the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. It's going to be a great day on Sunday. We're going to talk about this. We're really going to hash it out. I think you're going to enjoy it. There's a lot of truth here. There's a lot of things that will help us in our everyday life, in our understanding of things that's going on in our hearts, in our lives, and in our world today. Listen, you guys have a great night. God bless you. Don't forget to send in those comments on Facebook Live if you've got a prayer request. We've had some come in this week, even during the week. And we thank you for those. We're praying for those. God bless you. We'll see you Sunday.